Okay, looks like people are still trickling in, but we will go ahead and begin. Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to be discussing how PE firms and portfolio companies can juice IRR. So stay tuned for that. Before we get to that, a few housekeeping things to get through. For those who are not familiar with me, my name is Lena Dobreer. I'm the Director of Operations at Opus Connect. Let's go ahead and share that PowerPoint if we can. Wonderful. Next slide, please. Great. So Opus Connect, we're a lower, middle, and middle market M&A focused organization. We are membership based. We cater to private equity firms, investment bankers, lenders, independent sponsors, and other transactional professionals across the US. We have main chapters in LA, Chicago, and New York, where typically we'd be in person, meeting for a roundtable or a panel in each of those markets. And additionally, we do Deal Connect events all around the country as well. So many of you are participating in our Ohio-based Deal Connect today, where we're pairing up investment bankers and capital providers for one-on-one meetings. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about Opus Connect, how we can help, who we are, please reach out to my colleague, Jacob Zeffrin. His contact information is below. He'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. As we shift to the next slide here, today you'll be able to engage with our panelists by submitting Q&A. So as we move through the discussion and questions come to mind, there's a little Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and submit your question there. Our moderator, Sean, will be looking through those. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Of course, these events would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So we definitely want to take a moment to acknowledge them. Focus Search Partners, I know Steve Finder was unable to join this morning's call. You'll hear from him later. Executive search firm. Check them out, look them up. If you have any questions, reach out. As we move to the next one, Plant Moran here. Do we have Jerry on the call? I think, let's see. I don't believe we do. Mike, are you from Plant or are you from Plexus?
Yep, no, I'm from Plant.
Okay, wonderful. Go ahead and introduce yourself and your firm.
Sure. So Mike Abramo, I'm a partner here. Plant Moran, global CPA and consulting firm. We serve primarily, middle market companies. 3,000 staff across the country, offices primarily in the Midwest, Colorado, and we do have 4 international offices. So our private equity group, we serve close to 500 funds. I'm based in Ohio in Columbus. I lead our Ohio private equity group as well as I'm part of our New York private equity team. So thanks for having us. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Let's move to the next slide here. Plexus. Let's see if I thought I saw Rami on. I don't believe so. Oh, here's Robert. Robert, go ahead and introduce yourself and your firm, please. Uh-oh. There you are. Robert, can you hear us?
Me?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Lena. So I'm Rob Stride of the Plexus Group. We are a national insurance broker and consultants and insurance technology firm based in Chicago. I'm a former corporate attorney, and along with my wife, who's a former investment banker, we head up the private equity group at Plexus, focusing on insurance consulting and technology solutions for PE firms focused on middle market and lower middle market companies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. And then, of course, Vorys, if we weren't sheltering or on lockdown, we would be in their offices in Ohio. So we definitely want to shout them out. We do have Sean Byrne moderating today. So we'll wait until we introduce the panel before he introduces the firm and himself. But before we do, we have a couple poll questions that we'd love for you all, the audience, to participate. I'm going to go ahead and launch the first one. This was going to give us a good idea of who you are and give a good idea to the panelists of who they're speaking to. So go ahead and submit your answers, independent sponsor, investment banker, capital provider, etc. We'll give it 20 seconds or so and then we'll begin. Don't be shy. You can see only half of you have submitted answers. We'll give it another 20 seconds and then we'll move to the next one. Okay, so 14% independent sponsor, 38% investment bankers, no capital providers on the debt side. That's interesting. Capital providers on the equity side, 10%, some of our sponsors, service providers, and others. Thank you all for participating in that. Let me share those so you can see. And then let's go to the next one here, which is not this. Incentives. How many of you have worked with tax incentives before? Just give us a quick yes or no. We're going to be discussing this. It's good for the panel to understand how many of you are familiar and how many of you maybe haven't had this experience yet. Great. So 29% yes, 71% no. Our panel will note, and we will move to the next, in-person events. This is a good one for us to understand and just kind of an interesting topic in general. When are you going to feel comfortable attending in-person events again? Are you comfortable now, maybe after January, not until there's a vaccine? Or perhaps you never enjoyed it anyway and you're happy with the virtual setting. Let us know, and then we'll move on. Answers are still coming in. We'll give it another 10 seconds. Okay. So it looks like 4% of you are good now, 17% maybe after January, majority of you not until there's a vaccine. Got it. And then 25% of you are comfortable with the virtual events. Awesome. Thank you for participating. This is great for us to understand as well. Let's shift to the next slide and one more after. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sean Byrne. He's going to be moderating today's panel with Vorys. Sean, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Lena. I really appreciate it. I wanted to start and thank everybody, thank our sponsors and thank my panelists for being here. This is all very different and a different experience. I'm of counsel at Vorys. I've been with the firm a little over a year. The firm, we're a full service AmLaw 200 firm with a national incentives practice. We do incentives work all over the country, and frankly, it's a lot of fun. I've been enjoying it. I first got involved in incentives and learned about this topic years ago. I was in-house. I was running a family office private equity firm, and we had a portfolio company we were getting ready to put on the market. 24, 36 months out. And we looked at all the normal ways to try to, increase value. We reduced, it was manufacturing business. We reduced SKUs, renegotiated raw materials, all those things. Then my CFO and the portfolio company CFO came to me and said, "Hey, we think we can get a free study and potentially grant money to help reduce utility costs." And we've been negotiating with the county. They may have a building that they can provide us if we'll agree to create 100 new jobs. They'll provide us a building for essentially 10% of what we were looking at for rent. And we went ahead and undertook those opportunities and saw a great, when we started taking it to market, meeting with the bankers, we saw a lot of value provided. And that was the first time that I saw what tax incentives could do. I'd never touched the area before. economic development and tax incentives could do. And so I'm really fortunate today to have a great panel who are working with tax incentives now and can share with you guys some of their experience really on the, on all the, what, why, when, where, and how to pursue, tax incentives on this, sort of ways that it can help portfolio companies as well as the PE firms. So with that, I want to start with introductions. Brian, can you provide some of your background?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Happy to be here. My name is Brian Gale. I'm the CEO and owner of a company called ID Images. We are a full service provider of package printing products, primarily labels. We do some other things as well. We've got 9 locations throughout the country from coast to coast. We're headquartered just outside of Cleveland, which is where the project is that we worked on. So looking forward to talking a little bit more. And as promised, my dog barked.
Thanks, Brian. We'll move on to Eric. Eric, can you give us some background?
Thanks, Sean. This is Eric Stavriotis. I sit in the Chicago office of CBRE, although still working from home. I help lead our location strategy and incentives team in the Americas. So we're working with small caps, mid caps, and large caps to help them evaluate their portfolio, work through location strategy, and negotiate incentives. And as you said, this is a great lever for small cap and mid cap PE backed firms to pull in terms of value creation.
Thanks, Eric. And Bo?
Hi, guys. Excited to be here. My name is Bo Wholey. I've spent most of my career as an energy-focused private equity investor out of New York. 3 years ago, I switched over really to the development and operations side, starting a company called Longreach Energy, which is backed by Fortress. And 3 years ago, we bought an old industrial property in Ohio and just started construction last year on a power plant there, as well as some other developments. And had a lot of success working with tax and other incentives as part of that project, and excited to share that today.
Thanks very much, Bo. Brian, could you talk to us a little bit about the project you're just in the midst of undertaking that you've recently secured incentives for, and give us a little background on that expansion and growth?
Sure. So we've been growing quite a bit, and we've outgrown our headquarters location. So we are looking for a new headquarters. And we started the process late last year, exploring things, and it really heated up, of course, as COVID took off this spring. And we were looking at multiple locations, primarily where we had a presence, where we had key executives. So we looked near Ohio, in Cleveland, where I am, and in Tennessee, were the 2 places we really focused on, where I've got my number 2 guy. And went through the process with the great folks at Vorys of understanding what was out there to assist us. And ultimately decided to stay in Ohio with the headquarters, and secured incentives that include an income tax credit to me for growing the company, for growing the employee base, a low interest loan, and then grants for training and for equipment. And when you add it all up, it's fairly significant to our operation, and the present value, is staggering based on what we paid versus what we're going to realize in the next few years. I'm bound by confidentiality about the specifics of it, but it definitely helped our process and will create meaningful return to us and to me as the owner of the business.
Brian, thanks very much. Bo, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with recently on incentives that you're working with?
Yeah, so we've had success with incentives really on 2 fronts. The first, I mentioned we're building a big power plant in Ohio. It's about an $800 million project. Of that, about 175 was equity funded out of the gate. One of the things we did right away is go to the county where we're located, as well as the school district and the township, and we negotiated an enterprise zone agreement. And the result of that is we get a fairly favorable personal property, or sorry, real property tax abatement. The terms of those agreements are public, so I can share with you the dollar magnitude. Without those enterprise zone agreements, we would have paid about $60 million in taxes over the next 15 years. As a result of the agreement that we negotiated, we'll pay about $15 million total over that same period. So it's about a $45 million tax savings over a 15-year time frame, which in the context of $175 million equity investment I think is fairly substantial. Switching gears, the other incentive that we were awarded, we applied under the federal Build Grant program 2 years ago for a separate project at the same location. We're building a propane rail loading facility. We were awarded a $20 million federal grant for that project. It's a $60 million project, so fairly substantial. About 1/3 of the capital cost is being funded by that grant.
That's great. It's great to be able to see that kind of value on these opportunities. Eric, can you talk us through some examples from your practice?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. A couple come to mind. We were recently working with a robotics firm that's a PE-backed firm based in the Midwest. They came to us and talked about their expansion plans, having recently been acquired by a New York-based private equity firm. As they talked about their expansions plans, they really had 4 or 5 different locations in mind where they either had major customers or they already had a presence. So we looked at all of those. We helped them understand both the labor arbitrage amongst all those markets, but also for them, the biggest needle mover were really the varying incentives that could be offered. The company at the time was projecting to hire another 300 engineering types to fuel the growth of their robotics business. And the incentives all in were in excess of $10 million in the location that they end up choosing. And those come in the form mostly of grants or refundable tax credits. So it acts like cash that gets paid out over a period of time as the company continues to hire and meet certain sort of pre-negotiated milestones. So, that's just a great example of a growth company that leverages incentives, helps them make a location decision, but also really affects the bottom line in terms of the financials. And their PE group was very excited about the returns there. Other examples, you see a lot of technology companies that are born on the coast, whether that's in Boston or New York or California, et cetera. A lot of them, as they're hitting their, second and third growth stages, will come to us and ask, where else can we grow? Where else can we plant a flag? We were born in a relatively high cost market. What are other options where we could access talent at a lower price point and just trying to be efficient with capital? As part of that strategy, there's all sorts of levers you could pull, right? Labor, real estate, but incentives becomes a big one. And we've worked with a lot of those companies to look at, flyover country and Texas and other markets and access incentives in a pretty big way. So lots of different examples about how you might go about it.
Yeah, Brian, that's great, Eric. Thank you. Brian, when you were looking at your project and considering where to locate, can you tell us a little bit about sort of the sort of the time it took, or what kind of efforts were needed in order to consider the different possibilities and negotiate the incentives, and give us a little more a little bit about that and working with and working on that so that people can think about it in terms of during the different stages of a company, whether it's as operations are growing and things like that, how to go ahead and define a project and take it to a potential incentive provider.
Sure. And I'll try not to make this a commercial for Vorys, but it might sound that way. We obviously worked with the Vorys folks, and they were fantastic in guiding us through it. So there were some requests for HR data and for our growth plans of were we going to hire, what types of positions, what types of salaries, what types of CapEx we were going to do. And really, it wasn't a lot of work on our end to put it together. We had the data. So my director of HR spent some time doing things like that. And on my end, it was a few phone calls. But really walking through the templates that Vorys provided, made our lives pretty easy. And it was actually a helpful process to get a couple of our executives involved in kind of the bigger picture and seeing the whole investment. That, yeah, we want to buy this piece of equipment for $1 million. Well, what else do we need to do? What capital improvements do we need to do? What type of people do we need to do? What kind of training do we need to do? And it really helped. We're a medium. We're a $90 million revenue company, so we're not huge. And getting people to think that way was definitely a good part of the process.
Thanks. Bo, a little bit about your experience, because you had two very different types of incentives. One that really deliver a lot of value. One is the local, working with the local county and your local jurisdictions, and the other's on the federal side. Can you tell us a little bit about how your team went about finding, for example, the federal funding and so forth?
Yeah, on the federal side, we realized probably 3 weeks before the application deadline that this program was even available. And so really scrambled to pull the application together, got it submitted in time, had to take a number of trips to DC to basically advocate on behalf of our project and why it was needed for the region. And ultimately, we're successful. We were awarded this $20 million grant. I think a lot of just competing projects in the region probably weren't even aware that this opportunity existed. So I think I've certainly been guilty as a private equity investor for most of my career of not focusing on incentives. I think my impression wrongly had been, hey, it's not probably the best return on time given other value levers we can pull and be focused on. But what I've learned over the last few years involved with this project, some of these programs are sizable. The ones that aren't, sure, there's an administrative burden just dealing with the application and then the ongoing administration for it. But a lot of that work can be outsourced. There are individuals I've learned, like the team at Vorys we've been working at, that do this as a career. And it's been so far a great return on time, be able to get these incentives in place.
Thanks. I think as portfolio companies think about defining, looking at incentives, it's really important that they sort of define a project and figure out what the plan is so they can really see what they need to go after. Eric, can you talk to us a little bit about how you work with PE firms, especially, to try to define sort of the project and help them identify where incentives can be?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I think defining a project is really just thinking about what are the next 2 to 3 years look like for the business. And when we say what do they look like, we're really talking about real estate. Does your current portfolio allow you to do what you need to do for the next couple of years? Headcount, do you have any plans to grow headcount, move headcount around based on your customer demands, consolidate, et cetera? And then capital investment. So we're really looking at those three main levers: real estate, headcount, and investment. And then you look at what the next couple of years looks like. Some companies will forecast out for 5, others companies can't forecast out more than 6 to 12 months. But you do whatever is possible, and you frame it based on those assumptions. And you start to look at where might we do all that? Where might we make the investment? Where does the headcount need to be? How are we competing for talent? And then of course, what the footprint looks like. And as you do that, often scenarios will come about. I spoke about a Midwest-based robotics company. It was pretty clear to them that they could invest in one of four areas, right? Either where their customers were, where they already had their main footprint, or they knew acquisitions were coming, et cetera. And that's how you define a project, right? And with that input, it's, you know, it's then sitting down with the various economic development officials, presenting the project, presenting those alternatives, understanding what they can do, and then weaving that information back into that overall business case. And I think the more you can look at it as a business case driven analysis, the more it starts to make sense, right? That's what this audience does every single day, is evaluate, you know, investment, you know, theories and business cases. So this is just another input to that.
Thanks. Brian, from a timing standpoint, when did you first decide to start looking at potential incentives, and what drove you to think about that initially? I mean, you talked about a little bit about training and the growth and so forth. What drove you this particular time to look for incentives on the potential transaction?
Sure. Probably two things. One of my close friends owns a business, and he went through this process a couple of years ago, and he was able to get some incentives. And then the community we're located in, I befriended the economic development director, and he reminded me, we want you to stay, we want you to stay, we want you to stay. Whatever we have to do, within reason, we'll try to do. You know, with that backing, when we started to go into the process, I think that's when decided, you know, we're going to take a structured approach. Just as Eric said, what's a business case, and what's a business case for where we should be located, you know, talked to the folks at Vorys quite a bit, and they advised me, don't let the incentive tail wag the business dog. And that was always in the back of our minds, is what ultimately makes most sense for the business. And the incentives are great, but there's again got to be that business case. So we started early on in the process, while we started to look at potential facilities where we would either build or buy an existing facility, and ultimately chose, you know, to buy an existing facility.
Thanks. Bo, on your end, I think you had mentioned before that your firm had some prior experience with incentives, the parent company. But how did you first become aware of the incentive opportunities that were available, and did you look at other locations, or really just focus in on the one spot?
Yeah, so Sean, our company is backed by Fortress. Last year we sold half the company to GCM Grosvenor, but I'd say both firms have good experience working with incentives. And that's really how I became aware of this Build Grant program, where we got the $20 million of federal funding. Is just Fortress is, I'd say, one of the better firms at getting grant awards and things like that. And as an example, there's a somewhat of a competing project owned by another large, very sophisticated private equity firm that probably could have also got a $20 million award, but didn't apply for it, probably because they didn't know about it. And so I think just finding I think working with groups like Vorys as well, that's probably the best way to, at the state level and the local level, figuring out what incentives are even available.
Eric, when you're advising companies and you're looking at them, how do you I think one of the things that we've talked about before is how important it is to really look at what the different options are. How do you help companies? How do you help the portfolio companies do that and work with their parent companies to make sure it makes sense?
Yeah, it all comes down to just kind of building, a dashboard really of what are all your your options from a real estate, headcount, tax incentives, and all the rest perspective. So we'll work with the portfolio company to kind of gather the data as Brian and Bo talked about, right? You get all the inputs around what the growth looks like, investment, et cetera. We build up the financial models that show, if you were to make this investment and hire these jobs in this market, here's what that 10-year operating cost or 20-year operating cost looks like. Here's what the upfront CapEx looks like over the next couple of years. And you're kind of working with those two models and building up a landed cost model. You take that with the portfolio company, you refine it, rinse and repeat a couple times, vet out some options that maybe don't work. And then we're often then going to the private equity parent, if you will, and presenting those options and helping the two make the right decision. Often, incentives will be, 1%, 3%, 5%, or sometimes more of that overall business case. It's not a huge number like, transportation costs might be or labor costs might be. But a lot of times it becomes kind of that tiebreaker, where you might have two locations that are about the same in terms of cost structure. And, the business thinks location A is better because it's near a customer, or maybe location B has kind of the inertia going for it. That's where they've always been, whatever it is. A lot of times incentives can be kind of that tiebreaker where that community or the state is essentially saying, hey, we want to make this successful for you. Here's what we're willing to put on the table to help tip your decision. And I think that often gets the attention of not just the CFO at the portco, but certainly the private equity firm that, might have a, 3 or 5 year horizon, and that number goes a long way.
Thanks. Along those lines, I think, when I've talked to clients and talked to people before, I've always tried to identify, look, there are different stages when incentives can play in. And from the private equity field, a lot of times we talk about, there's acquisition, growth, and disposition. And so I think really, even before acquisition, you can be thinking about what types of incentives are available, what types of programs might be there for consolidation of that acquisition, or incentives to retain the operations where they are, even if there isn't growth. And I think, I recently have been advising a company where they, merge, as a strategic acquisition by a PE firm of two, an operating company in add-on. And there was a robust discussion about whether to or where and what the benefits were, and end up, creating 3 to 4%, benefit to the bottom line. Not a huge amount, but every bit helps a lot. I wanted to kind of start with Brian and ask you, I know you've done a number of acquisitions. As you think about your next acquisition, how does all of this kind of play in, and where do you think, do you think this will have some impact, and how can it be helpful?
Yeah, definitely, Sean. Even right now, we have an incentive to grow our employee base here in Ohio. So we just had, actually this morning, we just had a resignation of a highly compensated employee. That person's going to be, that position currently is not based in our headquarters. It will be soon. And I've made that clear to our HR and the hiring manager that that position is going to be located in Brunswick now. So it certainly does drive some things. And then as we look at acquisitions, again, depending on the size, as we get into bigger ones, it will certainly make sense to explore what is available to either keep an operation or consolidate an operation. As I mentioned, we've now got manufacturing facilities from Boston to San Diego, 9 throughout the country. So we don't really need to add a lot to our geographic footprint. And incentives will determine, whether if we acquired something, for example, in the middle, we have a plant in Arkansas. Do we need to be in Arkansas? Candidly, no. But if we had another opportunity to either grow that plant or consolidate that plant somewhere, we would certainly explore what incentives are out there.
Thanks. Bo, you know, I know your business is a little bit different, but maybe you can tell us how can incentives play a part in other ways for your ongoing business? You know, you've obviously gotten some incentives with respect to the real estate tax abatements on the real property and to help, you know, build this new facility. Are there other ways that they can help drive value for your company?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly been trying. I'd say the negotiating leverage is the highest prior to making an acquisition or making a final investment decision on a new project. And I just, you know, we've spent a lot of time with the state as an example, trying to get additional incentives from the state, and really haven't been very successful in doing that. I think we would have had a lot more success had we done that prior to purchasing the property and making the investment decision to move forward on these two projects I talked about. And as a point of comparison, there's a project just to the north of us in Ohio, with a Thai petrochemical company that's announced that they're going to be building a big plant, but prior to making their final investment decision was able to get, I think it's $30 million from the state for just site preparation work. And we tried to get funds like that from the state, but given that we had already started construction, we just didn't have as much negotiating leverage at that point.
Thanks. That's a great point. Eric, can you talk a little bit about how you've seen that play out as far as the timing, you know, in terms of advising clients, you know, early and often to think about this before making, you know, firm commitments?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, you look at these levers, whether it's headcount or capital investment or real estate, you know, the analysis around what type of incentive might be out there and how much, how you might get it structured, all of that has to be done before you make those decisions around, you know, where to make investment, where to hire the jobs, or, you know, where to embark on a new real estate project. Once you've done those things, right, that incentive is going to fall off the table, and, you know, the next opportunity, you wait for the next window to open up when you have another round of decisioning. You know, some of our largest clients, you know, the Fortune 1000s of the world, will look at their capital investment budget on a year-over-year basis, and they'll run 5 scenarios every January. You know, if we're going to spend $200 million this year somewhere in our 50 facilities around the globe, where is it best to spend it, all else being equal, right? And they'll come to us with, you know, what those scenarios look like, and, you know, we'll paint the picture, and then they'll go make that decision. So they just kind of do it on a recurring basis. And other PE shops we work with will do it pre-acquisition, where they'll come and say, hey, here's the target, you know, we're under NDA, here's the company we're looking at, here's where they have facilities. Do they have any existing incentives already? We'd like to know that. Based on where they're located, what do you see the opportunities for consolidation or relocation, and what incentives might come out of that? And some of those folks want to know all that information, you know, pre-acquisition, because they want to underwrite that into their valuation. So lots of different ways to look at it, Sean.
I think that is really critical. That is really critical from a timing standpoint, and there are opportunities both pre-acquisition and post-acquisition, but factually, the further along you go, the fewer the opportunities available. So I think that's really important for people to be thinking about in terms of strategy. It's not really too early to start thinking about this when you've got a potential acquisition under an NDA. It's not too early to look at, you know, what's your plan for the business, and operationally, if you're thinking about growing the business or moving the business, and what opportunities are there, because it may not be a huge difference, but that difference, that 1 to 5 points, 1 to 5% increase, that, you know, 100 to 500 basis points of value can really make a huge difference in the overall timing, especially as you start preparing for disposition. I don't know, Brian's in a little different situation because he's been just focused on building. Maybe in his past experience, he's got some experience on the disposition side. I know, Bo, you probably got some, and Eric, I know you do. Can you talk a little bit, and I'll let Brian kind of jump in to get started, and then we'll kind of move through the panel. But how do you think about using these incentives to sort of maximize the disposition piece?
Sure. So, my background, I'm a former investment banker before I came to the other side of the table, and kind of run the business as our family's private equity ownership, my wife and me, and every asset's for sale. So certainly this has opened my eyes to make sure you explore all the avenues out there, and we've discovered some other training programs in various states that we didn't know existed, where essentially it's free money. We're hiring people anyway, and we're training them anyway. And if we can get professional training or even on the job training, some of the states will help cover. It helps a lot, and it helps. To Sean's point, every financial person looks at those numbers, and anything you do to increase that bottom line helps. So I think it's an ongoing process that really every company should be exploring.
Yeah, and Bo, I know you're in, with Longreach, you're in the early stages of building this business, but just wanted to, based on your experience, if you had anything to add on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we did. You're right. We're only 3 years into it. We did sell half of the company last year, and I believe the buyer most likely gave us a bit of an uptick in the valuation, just given that we had this $20 million federal grant. This is the first time that I've, had incentives built into a sale case model that we've provided to a buyer universe. So certainly something that we're going to continue to do going forward.
And Eric, if you want to expand on your experience on this a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, the portfolio companies that are being sold, it's very common that at the sale, right, the PE firm will gather sort of an abstract of what incentives are still out there that have already been negotiated, kind of what that cash flow looks like that the buyer will inherit. I think what's important to note is, especially on the tax side, if it's a cash grant, and the company just needs to keep hitting their milestones, then great. The new buyer can factor that in, and that becomes a multiple. That's terrific. Some of the tax benefits can flow through to the acquiring entity, but you really need to scrub the agreements underneath those benefits and make sure that they will flow through to the acquiring entity. The acquiring entity can actually use them. Other times those tax benefits can be sold or transferred. And then you want to kind of think about, is it better to sell it now? Is it better to sell it as part of the business, and go through that valuation. So I think there's a lot of ways this can play into, the back end sale of the business. And, like you said, Sean, every piece counts, and the larger the package, the more impact it might have at that sale.
So in thinking about the different types of incentives, we've talked a little bit about sort of Bo talked a little bit about the property tax abatement piece. Brian talked a little bit about income tax grants and job training opportunities. Bo also talked a little bit about some of the federal tax, federal grant programs that are available. Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the other programs that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think in addition to those, you have, really kind of 4 buckets. You've got financial, right? So you've got cash grants, low interest loans, forgivable loans. You've got anything tax related. So property tax, sales tax, use tax, franchise tax, income tax, and offsets to all those. Then you've got a big component in the human capital side. So assistance with recruiting and training. You see university partnerships that a company and a university will form to help them establish their brand on campus and get internships and thus get candidates out of school. That's a very popular mechanism. A lot of times that can be funded by some sort of incentive program and can really move the needle, as that company gets the best of the talent that's going to help drive their business. And then you see a big category of kind of other. So it might be site and infrastructure, it might be utilities. There's a whole host of other things that kind of might move the needle for a company, either with respect to a site or a location. So it's a pretty broad spectrum. And I think, kind of makes it kind of, kind of a menu approach, right? What's going to move the needle for that project or that decision?
Yeah, and I think pulling from my experience on the governmental side, I think the thing that the companies don't always understand and the applicants don't always understand is that the government wants to incentivize the project and they want to win the project. They want to, even if they have a feeling that you're leaning one way or another, a lot of times they want to be able to take credit for the work. And so there are a lot of opportunities to go ahead and ask. And you want to ask at every level, because what you find a lot of times is that there sometimes are federal incentives. It depends on the type. There are state and local incentives. There are often partnerships with, for instance, in some states, there are sales tax incentives for development projects for instance, the development of the project, the new construction can be sales tax exempt on construction materials. In Ohio, that's through port authorities. I know Georgia uses port authorities. There are various different states that use different programs on that. Another area that's come up recently, and we've been looking more at in the last few years, is working with utilities and regulated utility markets to get to seek reasonable rate arrangements for large users of energy, especially, for example, in Ohio, it would be electricity. If you've got clients who are large users of electricity, we've seen the PUCO in Ohio, the Public Utilities Commission, enter into reasonable rate arrangements to help incentivize the project, and then have the applicant use that money for training or other things, but remembering that money's fungible, so those would be expenses you have incurred otherwise. And I guess want to just see if if Eric or Brian or Bo had anything to add on sort of that those areas, or anything that they've seen or questions.
Yeah, this is Eric. Sean, I think you mentioned utilities. That's a really interesting area as well. A lot of companies, even small and mid caps, right, as they're looking at where they're located, they're thinking about their carbon neutral goals. They're thinking about the mix of utilities, the generation utilities in the markets they're in. And that just strikes a conversation, right? And as you said, if there's expansion plans upcoming, a lot of the times the utilities will either have funding that they can put into the site and infrastructure to help an expansion, or they'll have like a rate rider or a rate reduction that they can offer for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever that might be, to help, because they recognize the company, has a capital investment and they're trying to help with that payback. So I think that's an active area as well, and probably one that continues to become more and more active as the utility environment, adapts to the new norms.
Thanks. I really want to encourage any questions from the audience. I think we've got one now. Okay, so the question is, are there special incentives for water filtration remediation companies? Same questions for CO2 capture. Are certain states more aggressive than others? I think that's a great question. Let's talk a little bit about that. Water filtration and remediation companies. I'll start on that with just basically touching on the fact that there are, and I'm familiar with the ones in Ohio, and I believe there are other programs. there are a lot of, there is, for example, in Ohio, the Ohio Water Development Authority, and they do work with localities and somewhat private businesses to help on water quality and water related issues. They have financing, and sometimes they'll put together grant programs, but they also offer very low interest financing. And that can serve two ways. If you're in that business, if you're in a water filtration or remediation company, or going into that business, one of the opportunities from that could be working with a jurisdiction that couldn't otherwise afford your services to be able to find that financing they need. So sometimes the incentive isn't just for you, it's for, it's actually for your customer. And the incentive can drive your customer's ability to use your services. I'm not sure about other programs on the CO2 side. I don't know if Eric or Bo, you're familiar with any of those.
Yeah, not at the state level. I mean, at the federal level, there's the 45Q tax credit program where I think you get $50 a ton if you sequester, or I think it's $35 a ton if you're using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. I mean, we've looked a little bit at the state level. One of the things we've looked at is, can we capture CO2 emissions from the power plant and sequester those? The issue we found at the federal level is that the $50 a ton credit just isn't enough to make the economics work. We've talked with the state of Ohio about that, but haven't really identified any incentives at the state level.
Eric, I don't know if you've had any experience on these issues.
I think it's just case by case, Sean. I think, the locations where that company may exist already or look to expand or locate, I think it's just part of the conversation, right? To explain their business and see if this moves the needle for that particular city, county, state, and maybe it influences their level of funding, right? If their goals are aligned, but a lot of times there won't be some specific incentive, right? You'll just lean back into whether that particular city, county, state happens to be aggressive and have funding and, interested in the project.
Yeah, and along those lines, that's why I think I've seen some of the more successful I've seen companies successfully bring programs actually to localities. So let's say, and the water filtration is a good example. I've seen companies that do construction projects where they will go to cities that they know, especially townships or villages where they know that a new system is needed. And they also know that the funding may not be there, but they're able to put together the plan because they've done enough of these projects that they can then take that to the state and help the local jurisdiction get the financing in order to hire them to do the work. And so I think sometimes on incentives, it's important to think in terms as broadly as you can, because there's sometimes when the incentive is actually going to run to the locality you're going to do business with. I think another example for those in Ohio is there are roadwork development grants. And those, for road improvements, construction of new roadways, even construction at aviation facilities. But that funding doesn't go to the company that's benefiting from that project. It goes to the local jurisdiction. But there are times when, you can leverage hey, I'm only a small piece of this, but if you build this road, you'll open up more land for development. And so I think it's really important to keep those opportunities in mind and think broadly about how incentives can incentivize not just your immediate bottom line, but your client's bottom line that'll help you do business with them. See if there are any other questions. I know we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. I want to make sure we answer everybody's questions. Brian, Bo, Eric, do you guys have any questions for one another? Or me?
No.
No.
Oh, good. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks. Lena, I think we are, unless there are other questions, I think we may be able to wrap up in about 30 seconds. And, I want to thank Brian and Bo and Eric and their, really appreciate their experience and expertise in providing information. I think I'm hopeful that the people who attended this have more information about how valuable incentives can be for private equity firms and for their portfolio companies. And let's see. We did get another question. Do we work during due diligence for PE firms? And the answer is yes. Oftentimes, and Eric will also attest to this, the time to start looking at this is during the due diligence process sometimes, because that's when you've got to look and say, you can get a sense of whether there's something. And a lot of times we will, we will actually get approval subject to the final final decision to move forward with a project. Sometimes you can even go forward with, a certain level of having the portfolio company seek approvals in anticipation of your acquisition. So thanks very much for that, and happy to answer other questions offline if people want to reach out. But thank you all very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Sean, and to our panelists. Thank you all for your contributions. To our audience, of course, thank you for joining us and for your participation. We do have another webinar coming up on Thursday. We're going to be discussing current challenges and opportunities for PE firms and portfolio companies managing financial risks. So going through some hedging strategies, etc. Look out for more information on that. If you are participating in today's Deal Connect one-on-one meetings, you're going to want to sign out of this link now and log into the separate link that my colleague Terrence Winters circulated yesterday. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to anyone on the Opus Connect team. This webinar will be posted to our YouTube in the next few days, so keep an eye out. But we hope to see you soon. And until then, stay healthy and safe, and we'll see everyone soon. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.